Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and this is week 10 of class. So this week we're studying chapter 22, or we're reading chapter 22, and we have a simple quiz, the week 10 quiz, which I'll go over at the end of this video. So this chapter is really short and pretty easy to get through, and I'm glad because the Asian history, so we're looking at China and we're looking at Japan this week, and really the Asian history is difficult, and I appreciate the fact that the book sort of took a high-level approach to China and Japan in this period of time of revolution. And the reason for that is because China especially is really complicated, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So before we get into this, there's a huge difference between China and Japan in the way things develop in the 1700s and the 1800s. And I think one of the reasons is that China is so big. I mean, the geographic area is huge. You're looking at an extremely large population, and you're looking at a lot of diversity between cultures. So anytime you get into a situation where a country is geographically large, has a lot of natural barriers, mountains, rivers, that sort of thing, and a lot of different kinds of climates, you also get different cultures based on the type of agriculture and other industries and crafts that really sort of pop up in the different cities. The point is that there's a real distinct personality between cities and regions in China, and without any modern communications and without any modern transportation routes, it's extremely hard to govern a country that big. So what you see in China are these dynasties. So we're going to talk about the Qing dynasty initially, or the Manchu. They're the same thing. And the Qing dynasty had been in place since the 1600s, actually, and really ends up in 1911 falling with the Chinese Revolution in 1911. So that's what the first part of the chapter talks about, and I think that it's important for us to understand the difficulty in governing such a large country without any kind of modern infrastructure. Now, what else is going on in the world? The chapters we've just read, I mean, we went through Africa, we went through India, and we went through the West, the United States and Europe, all through this period of time in the 1700s to the 1900s. And of course, the U.S. part we know, the American Revolution, the Constitution in the 1780s, and all the development in the U.S. And then also when we talked about Western Europe, all the modernization going on in Western Europe, and we even read about the scientific revolution and Einstein and some of this other stuff in the early 1900s. So that kind of gives us an index or a context in time as we get into China. And as you read about China, you might think, these guys are really kind of behind the rest of the world. And I guess in a sense, if you judge modernity or industrialization as advanced, then China is a little late to the game. But it's not entirely a cultural thing as much as it is, again, this difficulty in managing a big country, but also the roots of China in Confucianism, because the whole idea with Confucius and all those writings is that the simple agrarian life is the best life. And China sort of shunned modernity when McCartney, the first English trader, went to China in the 1700s. He brought the emperor all of these manufactured goods, and the emperor is like, we don't want any of this stuff. We're not into tricks and trinkets and toys at all. And that's the way China felt about the West. The other thing that's interesting, and if you've never looked at any Chinese history, is that the Chinese really thought the Brits at first were barbarians and savages, and the way we dress in the West was so much different, and the fact that the Brits were really only interested in making money and trade, that really turned the Chinese off, because again, they saw the English and the West as really corrupt and spoiled by notions of trade and manufacturing, and the Chinese lived the proper way, and the proper way was to revere nature and to revere our agriculture. So really, there's this huge cultural chasm between the West and the East. And, the story is that the Brits, of course, are the first ones to go into China, and they want to trade with China. But China wants nothing to do with the West or the outsiders. They don't want that influence in their culture. So the English are initially only able to trade through one port, which I think is Canton. So, but the British want to trade more, and the reason the U.S. and the British and eventually the Germans and the French, the reason they all want to get into Asia is because they're chasing this Asian myth that the West has chased forever. I mean, they still are today. And the idea is that, hey, there's 500 million people in China, and if you sell every one of them a pair of socks or an aspirin or a hat, you're going to be wealthy. And there's this idea that all the Westerners wanted to come in and take advantage of this market. Now, what they weren't thinking about is that most of the people in China were rural, and they had no use for manufactured, clothing and pots and pans and those types of items. They had their own cottage industries. They were getting by just fine. And so this Western myth persists to this day that, boy, if I could sell again, an aspirin to everybody in China, I'd be rich. But there's too many cultural differences for that to happen. But that's really the reason the Brits pursued the Chinese for trade, and to the point where when China, after the McCartney mission in the 1700s, really said, hey, we don't want to trade with the West, so just stay out of our ports and harbors, the British actually got aggressive, and you'll read about the Opium War in 1839, and that was really one of the first conflicts. So at that point in time, in the 1830s, Britain already had possession of India as far as the part of the colonialism, and opium was grown in India. So the Brits were taking opium from India and selling it in China, and it got to be a real problem. Initially, it was just for medicinal purposes, but like other things, it went recreational real fast. And now the population of China, especially in some areas, was demanding opium, and it was opium for the Chinese, and then the English would take tea out of China and take it back to Great Britain. So that was this trade, this opium tea sort of trade and triangle. And opium obviously caused a problem because it's highly addictive, and it caused lots of issues in the rural areas. And China tries to shut that trade down, and they try to do it by force, but they are absolutely no match for the British Navy. So in 1839, the British goes into a couple of major ports and just really starts to blast the Chinese, humiliating defeat for the Chinese. And in the end, China has to suck it all up and agree to trade with Britain in a number of ports, and the opium trade flourishes again. So it was really a mess. But the Chinese were so underdeveloped as far as a military nation goes that they were no match for any of the Westerners that came in with their big navies. So the Opium War, there was a couple of Opium Wars, but the one in the book is really the first one. So I think that's 1839 to 1841, 42, somewhere in there. And after the English or the Brits won the Opium War, they took possession of Hong Kong, which is an island. Look it up on the map. And just recently, in your lifetimes, Hong Kong was given back to China, but the Brits had it since the mid 1800s. So there's that part of it, and we'll read more about Hong Kong as we get into other chapters. But in the end, after the Opium War, the Britain got all this stuff, all these concessions. They got Hong Kong, they got approval to trade, and really this influence of Western culture on the Chinese is some historians think is the main reason for the downfall of the Qing dynasty. But there were a number of other factors, and you'll read through it. You'll read about like the Boxer Rebellion, and you'll read about Sun Yat-sen, and he was a reformer that came in 1911 during the Chinese Revolution. The whole point is that there's so much going on in China. Historians have a very difficult time saying, hey, this is why this happened, or this is why they industrialized late. And it's a big source of debate between historians all the time. But for us, we can just keep it simple. China was big, it was complicated, there's no communications, there was no transportation, so it was really hard to hold the society together. And when you think in terms of nationalism, it was next to impossible to get sort of a nationalist impulse going because it was hard to get these widely disparate groups together to form this Chinese identity, if you will. So, there's a lot more exciting stuff to come with China as we move forward with Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, and then, of course, Mao Zedong and the Communist Revolution. So we're going to talk about those coming up. But just understand the Qing dynasty collapses in 1911. So what's going on in 1911? We're approaching World War I, and it is starting to modernize around that time, but slowly. And the book talks about Chinese society in transition and talks about what I'll call sort of an intrinsic economy. So regardless of any government structure or lack of government structure, in the cities, there's always an intrinsic economy going. In other words, people need stuff. So people need stuff and other people make the stuff that people need. And there's always this intrinsic market, whether it has to do with food or essentials or, whale oil or petroleum for lighting. And so Chinese industry grew up really based on this intrinsic local economy and not on the backs of any government programs or import-export business other than tea. So there's that part, and when you finish reading about China, you'll see that it ended, or around 1911, it was really carved up. So everybody came in. England came in, the U.S. came into trade, the Germans came into trade, and then there are other instances of imperialism or colonialism in Indochina and down in Burma and down in Vietnam with the French. So it's a real complicated situation. But all you need to remember for any of this is that there was an old dynasty called the Qing. It fell, and by 1911, China was in transition and it was reforming to the extent that it could. So that's it for China. Just know about the Qing dynasty, know about the Boxer Rebellion, the Opium War, and understand how imperialism and Western influence affected China. And you'll be good to go. And we'll go through the quiz here in a little bit. Okay, so let's move on to Japan really quick. So Japan is really different than China for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's small. It's contained, and the people are very autonomous in that everyone's alike in Japan. They're not as spread out culturally. There's not the cultural differences that you find in China because the geography is where people live is all kind of similar, and the culture is much more nationalist because it can be. There's modern communications. It's a small country. There's a rural population for sure, but in general, they're more educated and communication is better. And those are the elements that not only build nationalism, but also allow a government to impose policies on a population and have them actually work, which that's what was happening in Japan. So if you remember Japan from 3-4 chapters ago, we were talking about the Tokugawa shogunate, and that was the ruling dynasty for hundreds of years. And by the end of the 1700s, that starts to unravel to some extent. And the Japanese were a very closed country, just like the Chinese. They wanted nothing to do with Western trade, and they were more successful keeping Westerners out, and really sort of this closed society, and not only in trade, but in relations. And just like the Chinese felt about the Westerners, the English especially, the Americans were considered really crude barbarians as far as the Japanese are concerned. So one of the first military officers to go in was Matthew Perry with the U.S. Navy, and the U.S. Navy had these steel-hulled ships versus these little junker ships that the Japanese had. So the Japanese really learned a lot from the West as far as shipbuilding and military might, and adapted to more Western methods quicker than China did, and really adapted to Western methods, but made them their own. So Japan is very successful in this period of time between the 1700s and the 1900s, and after Tokugawa fell, then we find the Meiji Restoration begins, and that is really this time of modernization and reform. And really, if you think ahead 30 or 40 years when we get into World War II, by then, obviously, Japan had modernized and industrialized because they had weapons of war that would compete with any of the Western powers at that point in time. So, again, we're talking a real tight time period here after the Meiji Restoration, this modernization, and really this rise in industrialization. Now, the issue is, if you've been paying attention, that with industrialization, imperialism follows, and especially in a country like Japan, because industrialization requires what? It requires raw materials, metals, petroleum, coal, all of that stuff, and Japan is not well endowed with natural resources, A, because it's very small, and B, it just doesn't have the oil or coal reserves or the mineral reserves that bigger countries do, because it's not geographically diverse at all, if you will. So, take those two things together. If you're going to industrialize, but you don't have raw materials, you're going to become imperialistic in the sense that you're going to have to send, your fleets out to find raw materials to feed your industrialism, and which also feeds the military in this case. So Japan gets really aggressive as far as being an imperialist country goes, and you'll read about Japan invading Korea, Japan invading China, and also Japan going north into Port Arthur, which is on the far eastern side of Siberia. So it's actually a Russian port at that time, and the Japan attacked Russia at Port Arthur and totally annihilate the Russian fleet, which was a shock and embarrassing, and it really woke up the world. It really woke up the United States to say, hey, wait a minute, Japan has a really strong military and a really strong navy all of a sudden, so we really need to pay attention to what they're doing over there because of their industrial aggressiveness, if you will. And I think the book calls it something like Asian fascism or something like that. But Japan became aggressively imperialistic, and again, because they lacked the commodities they needed, they had to go out and get them. And if you hear anyone talking about the new imperialism, that's always imperialism that's based on industrial needs. And that's what we're talking about here. So there's that. Japan expands into Russian territory. They take parts of Korea. They take parts of China. And they're not well loved in the neighborhood at all. There's still to this day, there's really no love between the Koreans and Japan generally, and China and Japan especially. And a lot of it goes back to the early 1900s and this imperialist period that Japan went through. So, Japan is getting incredibly nationalist. They're coming together. They're getting really strong with their military, and it's going to cause some trouble down the road, which we'll read about in the next chapter. So that's it for this week. Sorry this is really long. Let me go through the quiz really quick. Let's see. So know the dynasties in China that we read about, but really all you need to know there is the Qing. So make sure you know that was in China and that dynasty fell at a certain time. Know something about the Opium War for sure. Know something about the Meiji Restoration as far as where it happened, when it happened, real basic stuff here. We just talked about imperialism, so I'm not going to talk about that, but Japan was imperialistic, so know that. And also know that the Meiji Restoration rose out of what? I mean, what came before the Meiji Restoration? And the answer is actually the Tokugawa shogunate, so that's an easy one. 5 questions, no big deal. Sorry the lecture's so long. If you guys have any questions, let me know. Everyone's doing a great job, and I appreciate it. Have a safe week. Take care. Bye-bye.